So life is all about stories, and Jesus was a master storyteller. And the story of his life and teachings was told as never before in part 4 of the Urantia book. And there's not a person here that hasn't been immeasurably enriched by that story. And we thank the Father eternally for that experience. With the young lad, it was a talent that is this good here? It was a talent that he began to develop at an early age. You might remember that the Nazareth folks used to come over to the family home on winter evenings and listen to the lad play his harp and tell stories. But of all the master stories, of course, the parables are the most famous. And some, like the Good Samaritan, have even entered the lexicon as a charitable man. Some, like the talents, define the word as we use it today, a man of many talents. When I was back in Cal State Fullerton, I took a Bible as literature class, and the professor, when he introduced the parables, we were a bit highfalutin back then. There were some folks there that thought that this was a little bit childish to be studying these children's stories, to which he'd challenge anyone, write me a better one. And no one did. But of course, your stories need to be geared towards the proper audience. And Jesus knew what he was doing. The world is not a prison house, but a kind of spiritual kindergarten where millions of bewildered infants are trying to spell God with the wrong blocks. So yes, the Master did make these simple, but he also made them deep and rich with meaning. And these stories have come down through the ages in the record and preserved remarkably intact until we have them today. So let me give you a little background on the production of the book. And you look to the acknowledgement in part 4 where the midwayers say, as far as possible and consistent with our mandate, we have endeavored to utilize and to some extent coordinate the existing record having to do with the life of Jesus. And specifically to make use of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the so-called 4 evangelists. And here you have them here. And you'll notice these first 3 guys are busy working while John is talking with God while this guy in the background does all the heavy lifting, which is really not too far from the truth, because John was blessed with a marvelous revelation even up to Edentia, and his associate, this Nathan, this Greek Jew from Caesarea, did write the gospel under John's guidance. So that's an accurate slide, actually. But it always struck me that the parables were the perfect illustration of the midwayers' mandate and intention, in that they took the parables, and as you look through the papers, you'll find them remarkably the same, a lot of times with exactly the same language and syntax. So the parables, to me, represented the best transition from the Bible to the Urantia book. And so I had professional experience in publication and design, so I began assembling these little parables into a folio. I'd sent you one early on, Jerry, if you remember, just little PDFs, and I kept doing this, and gradually, I never had any real intention of publishing it, but one day I saw a book in Barnes & Noble, and it was just beautifully done. And I said, this would make a remarkable presentation for the parables, my design philosophy. And so there we were. And so I began to assemble these stories, and I didn't want a lot of pictures of Jesus, because a picture of Jesus, even if it's beautifully done, there's an inherent problem in it, that we all have this concept of what the Master looked like in our heads, and it'll either be right or maybe it won't be right, just how he looked. No one knows. So I decided to use a lot of other illustrations instead. And the Shroud of Turin, you all know what that is. Since the 14th century, that has remarkably influenced everything from fine art to the miraculous. The Toast of Turin. Mm-hmm. No, that's the Toast of Turin. They're entirely different. Yeah. Yeah, that came out on my toaster one morning. I tried to sell it on eBay and I got zero for it. So the general design concept is to take the spread and use the introductory part that comes from the Midway narrative and then have an icon or an illustration, some setup, and then to tell the story with the illustration on the left and the story on the right. And so that's a basic design concept. And for the lesser parables, and I say lesser as you might say the lesser prophets of the Bible, they're not less quality, but they're just shorter. I would set them up like this. And so I continued on this and eventually came up with a compendium and went ahead and published this book and printed 2,000 copies. And I made no mention of the Urantia book whatsoever up front. My intention was to let the Master's words speak for themselves. I didn't want to muddy the water up front about an alien Bible and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was the way to do it, and that was wrong thinking. Because it didn't have a home. In the publishing world, you've got to be something. And you've got to have an author. I mean, who wrote this thing? Well, it's bad enough, the Urantia book, but this is just a regular book. Who wrote it? No one knows. So it had nowhere to live. And it rather languished. And then when I first published it, I sent a copy to Mo Siegel. I didn't know Mo at the time. And I said, Mo, I just wanted to apprise you that I'd done this and this thing was on the streets. And he called back enthusiastically and said, good luck with it. And a while back he called again and said, you can tell me to go jump in the lake, but what would you say if the foundation published this thing? Because they were going to set up a publishing arm, Urantia Press, that would do secondary works. Nothing with the circles, but anything that was related to the book of quality enough to do it. And he said the trustees have agreed to this, all of them, which is monumental in and of itself. And what would you say? And it didn't take me more than 5 minutes. I said, you guys should have done it in the first place. You guys are the publisher. So it's only fitting. So we agreed to a joint venture, and I transferred the copyright to the foundation. And Mo sent a copy to their distributor that had been distributing the papers for all these years. And there again, it was the same exact thing that I had encompassed. They ran it by their Christian publishing group, and they said, what is this thing? This is a wolf in sheep's clothing. In the Christian market, you have the Bible and nothing but the Bible, or stories about the Bible or people's relation to the Bible, but you can't sneak a Trojan horse past this market. They're not. However, they were excited to carry it as a companion to the Urantia book. The publishing business is no different than any other. It's all about what's new, what's out there. And you've got this tedious tome that's 80 years old and it hasn't changed, and it's hard to get shelf space. So possibly this new rendition would be just a thing. So we went ahead and published this thing, and my cover became this. And my publishing firm became this. And you see the logo is, of course, an homage to the dependable David Zebedee and his Messenger Corps. And So we printed this book with their old longtime printer, R.R. Donnelly, and they printed it at their China plant. And in all my years of printing stuff, it was one of the best experiences. These guys did the greatest job. The end result was better, heads and shoulders above the relatively well-known American firm I'd used, and so much for Buy American. And some people feel, you just asked me on the way in, you said, I don't have my name on it. Well, in the back of the book, I do take a credit as an editor and a designer and a producer, but I didn't want the chief seat at this table. Now, I didn't write a single word of the book. It's taken verbatim from the papers. I wrote captions and back matter and notes and whatnot, but in the textual thing, it's all verbatim. I did rearrange things slightly to better fit the flow in the narrative, but as far as the master's direct quotes, you never touch those. To do that would be analogous to this.
What's that? A bunch of apes.
Bunch of monkeys typing. You've heard the million monkey theorem, right? You put a million monkeys in a room with a typewriter, eventually one of them will come up with a Shakespearean play. I didn't think that was going to work. And to the end, all of this was of great benefit because no longer being coy about the source material, we were able to go through, we were able to rearrange it. Tamara Strumfield, who's now the executive director at the foundation, offered a lot of help on that. We revised the back matter. We were able to include a couple of Mohs paintings, like this one of Russ Dawkin, the master boat builder, and this fine one here from Michael Dudash. And so the book was much, oh, there's one more thing. Whoops. One day, Tamara, she called and she said that she had showed the book to one of the millennials that worked at the office there. And her comment was, this thing is awful white. What do you mean white? I said, well, I hadn't really thought of that. Just like everyone here, I don't have any bigoted bones in my body, but I looked at it and I said, yeah, she's right. And especially considering we all know the kind of tentative ground that the Urantia book is on anyways, with some of its racial comments anyway. So we went through the book and identified certain images that could be changed. The book started with this image here, which is about as bucolic and white as you can get, right, to illustrate the sower, and changed it to this. It was a beautiful improvement on opening the book. And I used the field from a painting that she used later in the book. Actually, the next page to illustrate another story. And then there was this one here that illustrated the pearl of great price. And it was changed to this. And you can't lose if your model is going from Diane Kruger to Naomi Campbell, right? Here was an illustration to illustrate the talents, and we changed it to this. And we're also able to get a tribute to one of the hardest jobs out there in working mothers. And then finally, there was this illustration on the back. And it was Gard Jameson who thought that the symbol, I called it the symbol of the Abrahamic faith, so I didn't really think about it being exclusionary since it's just 3. But he said we should maybe make it more universal. So we added these 20 symbols of the world's religions on the bottom. And we ended up with a much better book. Speaking one more thing about Tamara, she wrote me the other day to say she wished she could pop in here to see me deliver the parable talks, surfer style, she said. Well, I don't know what that means, but it got me thinking, did Jesus surf? Who knows? The papers don't say anything about that. You don't mention it. But there could be a little hint in this story right here. Now, we all in SoCal know about Henry Huntington, a common name. And he was a railway magnate, and back in the early 1900s, he built a railway line called the Pacific Electric, or the Red Cars, and he took it down to Redondo Beach, where he had properties like this pavilion here and the world's largest saltwater plunge. And he got this strapping young waterman named George Freeth, who was a Halle, but he had Hawaiian descent. And Freeth is known as the father of modern-day surfing. And Huntington hired him and got him to give surfing demonstrations in Redondo Beach. And thousands of people would come to see this guy stand on his big redwood log. And Huntington, the consummate promoter, billed him as the man who can walk on water. So, what's the point of all this? He got me thinking that maybe that stormy night on the Sea of Galilee, what Peter really saw was Jesus surfing. Okay? It's there, it's all the way. No, Pat. That's how it really came down. I got that from one of the midwares. That's from their collection. Yeah. Yeah, see, look, Peter wants to do a tandem thing. He's saying, no, Peter, this board is too small. Board is too small. Learn to surf on your own. Get back in the boat. So anyway, before...
Is this in the book too?
Yeah, it is. You'll find it in the back matter. Before we examine the stories about a little bit, there's one essential component of drama, of any good drama. Anyone? What's the one essential component of drama?
Tragedy and comedy.
What?
Tragedy and comedy.
No, it's just one word.
Climax.
Anticipation.
Conflict.
Okay.
Conflict. And more conflict. Conflict drives everything. You see, in drama, conflict is the challenge that the main characters face in order to achieve their goals. Without conflict, you don't have anything. There's nothing to talk about. You know, if everyone's going along and sitting under the tree, you got like Spock kissing the girl, and you got nothing. So the parables mostly demonstrate two kinds of conflict: man against man, or man against himself. And as you look through the stories, you'll see Jesus uses conflict in all different ways. He uses it eternally or he uses it externally. And conflict can either be resolved with what we call a good ending, or it can be open-ended, where there's no resolution to the conflict, which might make the listener think a little bit about the story. Jesus uses both, sometimes in the same story. Sometimes his parables have an unexpected twist, what we'd call a hook. And they're cleverly designed to draw listeners into it, to get you to make a mental picture of what's going on. And Jesus, being the master of many things, was also, of course, a master of words. He can tell a story with one sentence. Here's a parable, one sentence parable. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. And if it's not a parable, he can tell a story in a whole line in many different things. One of my favorites, and it's funny, for you indeed encompass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you've succeeded, you're not content until you've made him twofold worse than he was as a child of the heathen. And you see this guy's whole thing, you know, he comes to Jerusalem and he's found spiritual enlightenment, and in a few years he's a wretched mess, hopelessly trapped in the past. At least in his previous life, he was probably having fun. The way he describes his own itinerant lifestyle, it tells the whole story. And how about this? in describing the indescribable worlds, the Master could have said, in my Father's mansion there are many houses. And everyone back then would have got that. They say, oh yeah, there's some big mansions. I see what you mean. You know, you could put 20 houses in this. But no, a simple twist on the words, and now you have something that's truly indescribable, beyond imagination. So let's get into the book. But before we do, we have a special announcement. Everybody gets a car! Well, not actually a car, but everyone does get a book. Let's get them out.
Okay, they're in that room, in those two boxes on there. Yeah. Would you mind that, all three of you? Make sure everybody gets one.
That was something that Mark contacted me back when we said we were going to do this, and said it'd be nice if everyone had a book, and can we do that? And so thanks to the governing committee here, the governing board, they footed the bill, and everyone gets a book.
We got a good deal.
Got a good deal. Because, yeah. What's that? Well, can I talk some more? I thought I had some more time. Well, I was going to do that. Yeah. Yeah. So you guys, we'll wait till everyone's set. Donation, you guys keep it.
I'm the treasurer.
Yeah. So a thumb on through the front of the book, you'll see, you know, as you open it, you see that this wonderful illustration that comes from the concrete Christ, which is, of course, Cristo Redentor, the Christ Redeemer overlooking the wonderful harbor in Rio. And get up here to the first page, the page 2 and 3, and here's this exposition that I mentioned. The parables in the book are set in chronological order, generally speaking, as they appear in the papers. But of course, we don't know if Jesus told the stories necessarily in that order. Assume so. But this is a perfect opening, even though there's a few that come preceded in the papers, just because of this very first line, very last line of this page. But Jesus answered, "No, Peter, I will tell them a story." And then he began to read this, or he began to tell this parable from a boat on the Sea of Galilee. And so it all began. And for the sower, Jesus quite appropriately starts with a nature parable, relatively simple accounting of 4 different things that can happen to a sower's seeds. And you see them illustrated here. But for the apostles, it wasn't quite so simple. This threw them into a tizzy. Matthew says, "Master, what is the meaning of these dark sayings that you present to the multitude?" They'd never heard the Master speak like this. And we'll find, we'll look just a little bit later and see what Jesus taught them about these dark sayings. So the Master begins to teach these men about the sower, and it's one of the only parables that he consents to make any sort of a interpretation about. And he gives them another parable that comes after that, the growing seed, which is illustrated by this fine painting from Santa Barbara. And then if you turn the page, you get into the Kingdom of Heaven stories, illustrated by this banner And these 6 stories are relatively quick. There's a few things here, the wheat and the tares. We all know this, but it's a specific thing back then. It was an actual Roman offense to do this. The tares are a form of darnel or ryegrass that's a poisonous thing that looks a lot like wheat that your enemy could come by and sow into your field and thereby ruin your crop. And dueling farmers are not all that uncommon. So it was a crime to do that. So these people knew exactly what Jesus was talking about when he told this story. There the little guy is himself. A sneaky guy. The mustard seed, there's a mustard plant down in Palestine. The birds can live in it. The leaven, another simple one. It's been subject to all sorts of strange allegorical interpretations through the years. But Jesus will demonstrate this in a few short weeks when he feeds the 5,000. The hidden treasure, I love this guy, man, he found a good one. And then the pearl of great price, as we've looked at before. And it's finished by this wonderful photochrome from around 1900 of these fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. And look at these guys, they could have been transported from the times of Christ straight here. So now we get to this section more about parables, and this is the part I was talking about where you were able to put this exposition up front where Jesus is explaining how the parables work. And it can all be summed up in this one thing. That Jesus was not a teacher who taught as the occasion, he was a teacher who taught as, he was not a systematic teacher. He taught not so much from law as by parables. And they give us this warning here, as the Master does, about attempting to make allegories out of his parables. You'll almost always get into trouble doing that. You can do it for your own fun and enjoyment, but as far as official interpretation, it won't be there. And as you go through the book, you'll find these 6 different points that are paraphrased from what the Master taught that night about the value of teaching in parables. This next spread has got a very nice narrative of the apostles as they start arguing about these parables. And Peter finds this really his allegory, and then there's part of the camp that likes his, and then there's another half that likes Nathaniel, and then they begin squabbling amongst themselves, and all about this simple interpretation of the sower. And it's very informative to read that. There's one thing I'd like to point out here, and this is quite interesting. This is Peter's interpretation from that night. Here's a passage in Mark where Jesus is giving us his explanation. Now, as you look, you see that they're basically the same. One, though, instead of being Peter's interpretation, is now attributed to Jesus himself. Now, I'm not suggesting any conscious skullduggery, but Mark's gospel was the gospel according to Peter. Peter did school him. It's been church tradition. The papers corroborate it. And so somehow it's interesting how these things get in there. So Peter, it wasn't yours. But to sum up everything in these pages, the Master says this: the appeal to human feelings is transitory and utterly disappointing. The exclusive appeal to the intellect of man is likewise empty and barren. It is only by making your appeal to the Spirit. And if you have 2 people meet, there's actually 4 people involved, 4 beings involved in the meeting. And there's different levels of understanding, so it's easy to see the channel of effective communication. So let's look at some of the stories as we go through. This is going down the unjust judge. Most of us remember this. I struggled with that for a while, and I had these images of justice and judge, because it's Unjust Judge is the name of the story. None of them were particularly compelling, but I went with them for a while. And one day I saw this statue, and I realized, oh, the story, it's not about the judge, it's about the widow. She's the one that's about. So you put a tear on the statue, and you've got an illustration for the story. Another one is garments and wineskin. And when people think of wineskins, they usually think of something like this Boda bag, you know? But Jesus' listeners would have known the wineskin to be something quite large. And therefore, a burst skin would have been quite an unhappy affair. And for a while, I used this image, and then one day at the Getty in Malibu, I found that one. And that's like from 350 BC. So that thing was around 300 years before Christ, and it's just beautiful. And the Getty has a very nice open content program where you can get usage rights to these kind of things for free. The Two Debtors is another familiar story. And I had this image right here. And it was kind of nice, maybe a little bit overt in its imagery. You know, there's Sin City in the background. And there's, the Abrahamic face up there, but it was serviceable. Then one day I was up in Cayucas, north of Morro Bay, and I saw this charming little chapel. And there it is in the windows, an eternal truth. And so I had to put it into and there we have it. But there was missing something. And what it was missing is our Reformed sisters, the one who gave up their nefarious life and joined the gospel. And that's kind of how the images come along as we go through all this. But this parable is wrapped up by this wonderful quote of infinite inspiration. If you go along, you come to the unfamiliar, the unforgiving servant. Look the way the artist is focused here on the main conflict of the story, that this guy didn't just go out and ask him for his money. He starts choking him, give me what you owe. And it's also illustrated right here in the next page. When his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were so distressed that they went out and told their lord, the master, the king. More conflict. In other words, you can get away with it with the master, but if you're an egregious enough little prick, your mates are going to rat you out. You can't get away with it. The workers in the vineyard comes next, and this is a very compelling image to first century Jews. That was a tradition of theirs that Messiah would arise out of a stem of David's ancestors. And there was a golden cluster of grapes above the entrance to Herod's temple. Must have been a marvelous sight. And
Where each grape would produce a gallon of wine, that one. Where each word describes. You know that?
no, I hadn't heard about that. Yeah.
Well, what their view was that he would create where each grape would be big. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah. But this is a fine story to illustrate it going into Matadorus, a rich young man who wanted to join the kingdom but wouldn't give up his money. And there he is represented by the golden grape. And the tale of the vineyard itself is one of those that people oftentimes find, hard to deal with. It's just not fair. It doesn't seem fair. These guys worked all day long. Why should they get the money? These other guys, they just were sitting there at the end. They came in and got the same. It goes against our sense of fairness. But Jesus opens the thing by telling us what he's talking about. The Father knows what he's doing. And if you look at the parable itself, these guys are there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the guy goes, "What are you doing here?" This is before the entitlement class. Why are these guys here? Well, they're maybe like the guys in high school that didn't get picked for the team. No one wants them. They're old, they're infirm. and this man is showing mercy. And there's a modern day equivalent to this. There's a guy named Dan Price, a CEO of Gravity Payments, a Seattle-based credit card processing firm. And he was pulling down a salary of big bucks commensurate with what any successful tech entrepreneur would be getting. And one day he looked at what his lower range employees were getting by on, and he decided it wasn't fair. And he decreed that everyone in the company, including himself, would get $70,000. Well, it effectively raised the salary of a quarter of the people were doubled, and they were, of course, rejoicing. But anyone north of 70, there was a lot of weeping and gnashing of tears, a lot of gnashing of teeth. So this fellow lost a lot of business. He, even his own brother sued him. But there it is. But it does remind us that you can only do so much so fast. The Melchizedeks are often telling us you have to insert things properly into the flow of evolutionary change. Rapid change is suicidal. You'll remember the story about, they tell us in the papers, this guy that dismissed his harem because he thought it was good, and the wives went home and their relatives were so upset they slipped down the next day and killed the guy. Right? You've got to be. Jesus puts it this way. Or this way. So we come to the Good Samaritan, which is, of course, with the prodigal son, two of the most famous parables. And he told this one night in Jericho. And it was a story that would have been well understood by his Jericho audience. The road to Jericho was steep, 18 miles from Jericho to Jerusalem, and in that time it climbs from like 800 below to 25 above. And all along the way in this rugged terrain were ideal hiding places for brigands, and it was known as the Bloody Way. And this parable fits right in. They understand it completely. And of course, we all know what it is. And I was going to use this painting by Walter Rain, a Mormon artist. It just beautifully illustrates it, until I came across this one by the Frenchman Moreau, which is a little hard to look at, but it just really epitomizes that Samaritan right there. Look what he's doing. That's brotherly love. I had this image for the Good Shepherd. It was okay, but a little bit pedestrian. And one day I saw a picture of this Carpathian flock in the Carpathian Mountains. So you throw in the shepherd, you throw in some still waters. You got to have still waters. You got to have danger. And here comes a freezing storm. And then what do you need to finish it up? You need a sheepdog. And there it is. This parable is interesting, and another thing I'd like to point out. Jesus says right here, "But I have many other sheep that are not of this fold." And these words are true not only of this world. And of course, we know that what the Master is referring to is his 10 million worlds to be in Nebadon. But in Christian theology, it's always thought that these other folds refer to the Gentiles, which is not exactly the most perceptive reading, because this was only a few months before the crucifixion. At this time, the Jews were already well on their way to rejecting him as a nation, and he had plenty of Gentile converts. So who are these other sheep that the Master is referring to? And this is fascinating, because maybe even in our lifetime, we're liable to see confirmation of intelligent life on other planets. Not by some Vulcan ship coming down on the Washington Mall, but the James Webb Space Telescope, and we're all charting all these exoplanets. And Christian theology is going to have a lot of thinking to do if there's ever confirmation of life on other planets intelligent. And if you look at it, there's plenty of theologians that are already anticipating the question and saying, what does this really mean? Did all of them have original sin? It's going to be fascinating. The rich fool comes up, and I mention this right here because there's an initiative from Google, which is exactly the kind of thing that tech companies should be doing with all their money. And they're cataloging fine art around the world and making it available royalty-free. And here's the painting I had versus the one from Google. You can just see what a fine quality image that is. High resolution, everything you need for publishing, and free. Here's just another little example quickly about conflict and the way Jesus adds it. The robbers came, we all know about that, but there's one little sentence here, and for the property which escaped the robbers, his heirs fell to fighting among themselves. So you've got a layered picture now about this guy. Not only was he a fool, he raised a whole passel of fools. They're fighting over his money. And what more wretched legacy than to have your kids fight over your money? The faithful servant is done by a Vermeer. Wonderful, wonderful painting. You wouldn't think this is illustrative of a parable, but the master says, "May the Lord of the house set such a servant over his household and safely trust this faithful steward to see that his children are fed and nurtured." And Vermeer is just a wonderful artist, one of the masters of the Dutch period. Just a wonderful use of life. The foolish carpenter. We're told that the carpenter is the only parable that Jesus used his own trade for. But that parable does find reflection in the Sermon on the Mount, the house on sand. This is from the Pharisee and the publican. It's a wonderful etching by Alexander Beda. You can see the detail. He did a Bible book with about 20 or 30 different etchings. Just wonderful work. You can imagine how much time it takes to do something like that. This is from the Great Supper. It's a coronation of a czar. And we're going to have to move on, but this parable should be noted that there's a setup to it. Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. It sounds like a harmless little saying, but what this Pharisee, what this lawyer is really saying is intensely racial remark. Because basically what this is saying is, the Jew is going to be blessed, but all you gentle dogs, you're out. None of you get to come to the table. You're out. Jesus crafted the parable to speak to this attitude. We come to the prodigal son. It's told in series with the lost sheep and the lost coin, and finally the prodigal. Jesus was fond of telling these parables in the same sequence, and they are found in Luke in exactly that sequence as well. The sheep shows us the interest of the Heavenly Father when a soul is lost. The coin illustrates how the Father and Son actually go out to search to find the lost ones. And finally, the story of the Son, who deliberately left, demonstrates how complete the restoration is. And here's some Rembrandt etchings that show the master's work as he ends up with this painting. Again, this is pre-Google, post-Google. Look at him. Just beautiful. The shrewd manager, You gotta love this little hornswoggler. You know, he's cooking the books, and he gets caught cooking the books. And what he does to get out of it is he cooks the books some more, so he'll have a golden parachute to get out of the deal. And so what better image to demonstrate financial selfish gain than Wall Street? But it wasn't right because it illustrated the greed, but not the good. So I got a couple people and put logos on them and dropped them in the shot. And there they are. There was also important here to go back a page, and when you read through this, you'll find the parable of Dives and Lazarus. It's a problematical one because it tells a story that a lot of theologians consider to be more than a parable, but actually a fact. And they interpret it that way, and they end up with that. That uses a euphemism that my dad never used. Yeah.
I work for the government too.
Yeah. Okay, so FUBARs are FUBARs. The Pound starts with this wonderful little story about Zacchaeus. We've all heard about him. He's this little guy, and he can't see Jesus, and he wants to, and so he runs ahead and he climbs a fig tree. And it's a familiar story, but the papers give us a little bit more detail. They say when Jesus stopped under the tree and called him down, that he almost fell out in his haste to get down, and you can just see this little Danny DeVito guy almost falling to his death. And here's another very open-ended story. When the grumbling starts, he stands up and he says, the men of Jericho, the great teachers come to my house, and on the morrow I will give half my goods to the poor, and if I've cheated anyone, I'll restore it fourfold. And Jesus goes off the next day with his apostles, and you think everything's well. Well, think about this guy a little bit. It's not easy to give away half your fortune. Bill Gates said it was far easier to make it than it was to give it away. He's going to have to set up arbitration review boards. He's going to have all these people accusing him of cheating him. Maybe his family's not too happy about seeing half their inheritance go out the window, maybe even his own wife. So a week later, he's in the midst of all this turmoil, and he gets news that the very man who caused this epiphany in his life has been crucified on a tree between two brigands. Crisis of faith. How does he deal with it? There's a story there. As they go up to, here's the illustration here. We put little Zacchaeus, there he is in his tree. Perfect. That tree exists, of course, in Jericho now. It's a tourist attraction. And as we go up the road, as we leave Jericho, this paragraph here sets it up. And they are going by this aqueduct. And this photochrome, again, came from the Library of Congress, Prints and Photographic Division. This is from around 1900, and it is along the road to Jericho. And it could very well be the setting that they stopped and had lunch, where Jesus told them the parable of the pounds. And as they leave, this is one thing. They tell us that this parable is one of the few parables that the master had to be founded on an actual historical character. Well, that got me thinking, well, what's the other ones? Let's see if we can see any more as we go along. But Jesus says, "Come, my brethren, let us go into Jerusalem, there to receive that which awaits us." And he begins his final journey in the likeness of the mortal flesh. This begins his final week. They go to Bethany, and on Sunday he goes into Jerusalem, and we all know it from there. And now we get to Jerusalem. This is Monday in the temple. And I've always thought there were two incidences in the life of Jesus that I think of as the Father's miracles. They're explained by the narrative, but they're not explained as to their cause. For instance, the first one is in Nazareth, during the Nazareth rejection, when these ruffians grab hold of him and they're minded to take him out, throw him off a cliff. There's a mob there. These guys are ready to do it. He goes along with it. All of a sudden, they get to the edge of the cliff. Jesus suddenly turns and quietly folds his arms and takes a step when the crowd parts. And he goes along his way. It's almost like the Father in heaven saying, hold on, boys. You can have him in a while, but not now. He's not yours. And the other one is this day in the temple. This is after the triumphal entry on Sunday. The cleansing of the temple is told in the Gospels, but very scant. And Jesus entered the temple of God and drove out all who sold and bought there. And he overturned the tables, so we know that. These are paintings that illustrate the three gospel accounts. John adds a little more detail. He adds whip of cords, driving them out, sheep and oxen. And so John's story can be told here. Now these accounts, these scant accounts, are missing one important critical factor: scale. Herod's temple was stupendous. Its precincts could hold 200,000 worshipers at one time. Look at this. This is like 2 Rose Bowls on New Year's Day. It was enormous, and there was just as big of a commercial traffic that had been built up into it. In this thing, there would be bazaars and booths all along the colonnades. These open areas would be filled with pens, with animals and sacrificial animals, doves, everything. This is a big enterprise. Jesus is teaching from Solomon's porch, which is down here on the eastern wall. And as he began to teach that day, his attention was arrested by 2 things, and one of them was the rent of the air from a herd of 100 bullocks that was being driven from one pen to the other. And there was also a nearby argument where some money changer was Jewing some guy out of his money. And the indignity of it all, and Jesus just stood there, as they tell us, and thoughtfully surveyed the scene, stepped down from the teaching platform, went over, grabbed the whip of cords from the lad, and swiftly drove this herd of 100 cattle out of the temple. That is rawhide, folks. That's more than 100, but I counted them. That's 100 cows right there. I mean, that's a big deal. But that wasn't all. He then majestically strides to the farthest pen and one by one releases all the animals. And by now the crowd is completely electrified. And Jesus never turns over any tables. He never has anything to do with them. The crowd does everything. They take care of it all. And you would assume also drive the rest of the animals out. This was all accomplished in 5 minutes. And that's why it's somewhat miraculous. It was some hive mind working. And it was essential. You see this right there, this up in the top? That's the Antonia Fortress. That's the Roman garrison. And Romans are up there watching all this thing. They see all this blim-blamming down there, and they are on their way to kick ass and take names in a hurry. When they arrive on the scene, peace has been restored. Otherwise, it's a bloodbath. That's all there is to it. So here again, maybe the Father in heaven is saying, you have my son for 2 more days, and we're going to have some peace and quiet around here. Right? But it was truly a miraculous cleansing. This kind of shows it, but again, lacking scale. And the papers say this: all this day, a day of quiet and peace in the temple courts, the people heard Jesus' teachings and literally hung on his words. And that again, they coordinate with the scriptures. It's taken from Luke's account. For the people hung upon his words. So the best I could do for this was to show the temple cleansed and take a little maybe inspiration from the sea of glass, and there's our cleansed temple. Who knows? When the Morancho temple comes down, will it be in Jerusalem? I don't know. The Jews think there'll be a third temple. Anybody's guess. Probably not Alhambra, but anybody's guess. So where are we here now? Jesus begins to speak here, and he tells the next 4 parables in the temple. And they all relate to the impending rejection of the nation of Israel and his mission. The first one is relatively simple. So much that the people answer the question. The second one is called the wicked tenants. I put this image together from these components, and we have a rather dramatic image of the dead son. And in this account, these people continually reject the advances of the landlord, and they begin killing his messengers, and they even kill his son. So who's Jesus talking about here? The people know, because after it they say, God forbid that we should go on doing these things. They know exactly what he's talking about. Then he tells the cornerstone. Again, a relatively simple story which is built on Psalm 118:22. But it's interesting because Jesus adds something that here we find in Luke, which is called the crushing stone. Whosoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. It doesn't tell us a whole lot, except maybe there's 2 different roads to perdition here. But here's what Jesus really said. And there is a mystery about this stone, seeing that whoso falls upon it, while he is thereby broken in pieces, shall be saved. But on whomsoever this stone falls, he will be ground to dust, and his ashes scattered to the 4 winds. Is there a historical figure that this reminds anyone of? Anyone? Judas? Is it Judas? Is that who the Lord is talking about here? Could very well be. Look at the way the papers themselves describe his death. Dashed to pieces. It's always been a source of, we talk about, is Judas saved? I don't know, who knows? They do say at one point where the worlds have found it hard to forgive Judas. Remember where they talk about that? And why would you have to forgive him if he wasn't around? So maybe old Judas make it. And since he was the master's follower for so long, I would tend to think that that lamb was saved. But that's not the point here. We get to the wedding feast. The wedding feast harkens back to the Great Supper. A lot of people think that this is the same, that it was 2 readings on the same tradition. But the parables, both in Luke and in the papers, are considerably different. A certain ruler, certain king, 1 invitation, 2. You can see what happens here. In the end, the guests are passed by, and in the wedding feast, the rebels are destroyed. And I was illustrating this with a wedding feast, and it wasn't really to the point. And one day I read the paper and I said, wait a minute. Jesus here is simply referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. He gave his disciples a much clearer prophecy next night on all of it. But here was his only public announcement of this prophecy of the destruction of the temple to come 40 years later. And so I ended up with this image. I do have a presentation here. How are we doing for time, Diane?
We have about 15 minutes,
Oh, good.
because we need time for questions and
So is that part of the 15? Oh, okay. Well, let's wrap it up then. Oh, I mean, he's giving me the heave-ho here. Let's see. As you go through this and get to the very end, let's at least get to the end. The very last story in the book, which is the washing of the feet. And that's not usually considered a parable, but here Jesus clearly tells us it is. And the Last Supper is commemorated down from early church tradition as Maundy Thursday. Maundy represents this command, a new commandment I give you. And it's celebrated with ceremonial washing of the feet to this day, because it was only after Jesus washed his apostles' feet did he give them the new commandment. So, in closing, let me hearken back to my professor at Cal State Fullerton and just venture a parable of my own. And it was like this. There was once a man born in one of the far corners of the universes. And although life was often stormy, it was also a land of great opportunity. And in due course, he made the mortal transit and went on to the worlds on high. And one day along the way, he met a fellow pilgrim. And as these conversations often began, this fellow asked him, where are you from? I'm from Urantia. You don't say, the world of the cross. I've always wanted to meet someone from Urantia. And since everyone in Nebadon is fully conversant with and vitally interested in the Master's world, this fellow is now all ears. So tell me, how did you come through that place? Lord knows there were some terrible times to be had down there. Oh, there sure were. Just beyond imagining, but not so much for me, thank God. I was born in America in 1955. Well, his new friend just paused for a moment as it sank in. He says, are you telling me you were born in the same time and the same place as the fifth epical revelation to that world? I am. And I'm also telling you that I read the papers for the better part of my life. I knew scores of fellow believers. It was the most marvelous thing I could imagine. Well, this pilgrim just stood there in utter astonishment and perhaps a twinge of envy as he added up the complete unlikelihood of the whole thing and finally exclaimed, the odds are astronomical. You won the cosmic lottery, my friend. Tell me, what did you do with all those talents? And that's it. Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Questions? Raise your hand. I'll bring the mic. Question, someone?
Well, that means we've
Here we
covered
go.
it.
Here we are.
I formulated
what first inspired you to do this book? I mean, were you thinking that the parables are a bridge
I was,
to those in Christianity and study of the Bible? Did you consider that in the beginning of?
that sun is in my eyes. Well, like I said, I was in the business, and I just saw these parables as being wonderful little stories that had a direct contact with the Bible. The folks that read the biblical Jesus could understand the Urantia Jesus as being exactly the same, because the parables were the same. There was a lot more detail. If you look at the book, there's some 20 some odd thousand words in there. About 15 of them are what we call red letter words. And so there's all this extra exposition about how the parables came to be. If you look at the Bible verses, there's like 7,500 words of Jesus to tell the same stories, so we have twice as many words. But in the Bible, it's almost all the Master's words. There's no background or illustration. That's why people a lot of times still have a hard time interpreting these things, because they don't know their context. And so that was the motivation behind it.
Thanks for this book. Thank you for this book.
Thanks to governing committee, they paid.
Any other questions? Here we are.
So, Jim, how long did it take you to do all the art? I mean, that's a lot of work. At photoshopping and whatever else you did to put it all together.
Not too long, considering I started reading the Urantia book in the 6th grade. I was a pretty early starter, so.
So you mean you were Googling back then, right?
No, I had no time. I've been a man of leisure for some time, just doing enough to get by, but wanting to spend my life in the Father's family. And so this was just looked like, Jesus says the field is ripe, but you got to put your hand on the plow.
Well, I'm hooked. It's as you were describing all the art and everything else and how well you did it. Well, thank you. It was a really good job.
And you're asking me, Pierre, you do the same thing. You devote your time in order for these projects that are beneficial to all of us, and that's what we're all doing up here. We're and there's a parable. When I don't want to get up there and have a hem and a hawing when I'm telling folks what I did with the 5th epical revelation. I want to have some stories to tell.
It seems to me like you're a natural storyteller. Your history in publications is probably one story after another story after another story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's likely to continue. What more stories or projects do you have in you that you want to express?
Well, actually, there's a very exciting one in the works, and that Mo Siegel, as you all know, is a man of means, and he's been commissioning work from some of the finest Christian artists in the world over the last a decade at least. And we're in the process right now of putting together a book. This book extracted the stories that Jesus told. This book is extracting the stories about him, but in a very edited form. Part 4 has got about 450,000 some odd words, and we've got it down to about 140 of that. And this book will be illustrated by these works of arts that not only Mo has commissioned, but his relationships of artists like Michael Dudash and the ones we've seen in here. And I was going to design the book, and then one day Mo called and he says, I've got this team that I can bring in, and this woman is a renowned designer and done work for National Geographic. And I hope you're not upset about it. Go for it, man. And we want, good. And so we just started meeting with this team, and maybe 18 months, 24 months, this book will be on the streets.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah. And so there again, it's just like you go out there and do something. Anytime I found in my life that I didn't see what it was there was to do, It just meant that there was already a job that had been given to me that I was slacking off about, you know? As soon as you do the work, then you get more work. It goes along. We need laborers.
Question here, Jim.
I have a question, yeah. Either the initial publication or this one that said Urantia on it, did either one have some, extreme negativity from the Christian community in regards to, changing what they thought the Bible is?
Yes and no. There's always going to be some folks that get their dander up when you fool around with the Bible a little bit, But again, in the case of these stories, it's pretty hard to find umbrage with them because they are just simple and they are the same way. There's all these additional things that we've gotten out of them that we could see are there, but you can't fault it. And again, the Midway Commission does what they said they want to do. If you're looking to compare the Urantia papers and the Bible, you want to use the 1901 American Standard Version. When the papers were indicted in 1930, that was the common book in seminaries and known as the Standard Bible. And if you look at that, I use the Revised Standard because it's just a little more concise. But if you look at that translation versus what not only they're saying in part 4, but in part 1, when there's all these scriptural quotes, you go to the Standard Bible and they're verbatim. That's the shame about the Jewish nation, is that they, even though they failed eventually in their mission to accept the Son of Man, they were responsible for a long line of prophets that illuminated the world to the point where there was fertile enough soil for the babe of Bethlehem to even show up. Excuse me?
I want to have you back when the next book is out.
Okay, but I only have to pay $100 next time.
One more question here.
Yeah, real quick, Jim. I've known Jim since 1971. And of all the people that I've known associated with the Urantia book, Jim has that familiarity and that ability, as you can tell today, to be able to talk about the Master's teachings, and not just in the parables, but in many of the other parts of sections of part 4. So I've always been astounded by that, Jim, and it's far, I just wanted to say thank you for many a conversation we've had, and
Yeah,
I'm
we've
just
had
sitting
our
there.
fun through the years.
I'm sitting
We've
there.
had our fun.
Sure.
And
But-
it's funny when we were back, it's just starting off, and someone say, "Oh, you read the Urantia book? How long you been reading it?" It was kind of like a source of pride, "Oh, I've been 10 years." "Oh yeah. How many times?" "Oh, 4 times through all this." Now you get to our point now, and someone says, "How long you been reading it?" You do
40
years.
45 years?
You don't want to let on,
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to let on what you've been doing 50 years, then. What are you made of it? So, but again, this is more than a parable. The publication mandate tells us that we have little idea of what we're participating in right here. And not to have any pride or arrogance about it, but in that day, that inevitable day when this Urantia book is part of the very fabric of this world, people will be vitally interested in what we did back here. I went back at church, I see John here, it was Saint Mark. And you think of John Mark, fighting the master for the basket. We would go on that Wednesday when he wants to go with him up there. You think, did that lad ever think that there'd be this beautiful Catholic edifice sitting on a corner named after him? Surely not. But who knows? We are participating in the birth of new age of religion on this planet. Right? We're in the thick of it.
Any last questions, anybody? You said the 6th grade. You had the Urantia book that early?
I think it was the 7th, actually.
How did you get it?
I came in with McNally and Jerry and all these guys. We were a bunch of hippies hanging around Fullerton and
1968 or something?
No, it was, no, we were coming out in early 70s.
I mean, you
and,
were a hippie in the 6th grade? I'm sorry, I missed that.
No,
Oh.
that was.
You were kidding about the 6th
Yeah,
grade? Okay,
yeah.
I see. I got it, okay.
Julia Fenderson took us in. She welcomed us. Not everyone did. Yeah, we were scary. A bit. We were a bit scary. But Julia knew otherwise.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I think it's time. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. It's been a pleasure. My pleasure.